The Valdris Imperium had conquered 412 worlds. Not metaphorically, not diplomatically. 412 civilizations had looked up at their skies, seen the shadow of the Imperial Armada blotting out their suns, and within a standard galactic cycle, submitted, surrendered, or ceased to exist entirely. The math was simple. The Valdris didn't negotiate. They calculated. They had war models older than most species' written languages. They had predictive algorithms that could simulate the military response of any civilization within a margin of error so small it was essentially zero. They fed a species' biology, population density, resource output, territorial instinct, and technological threshold into the Dominion engine. And it told them exactly how long the war would take, how many casualties they would absorb, and what the optimal extraction rate of the conquered world would be post-pacification. In 412 conquests, the Dominion engine had never been wrong, not once. So when the Valdris turned their expansion vector toward a small, oxygen-rich world in a minor spiral arm, a world the locals called Earth, Supreme Executor Valdorn fed the data into the engine with the casual indifference of a man signing paperwork. The humans were young, barely 6,000 years of recorded civilization. Their fastest ships couldn't break past the edge of their own solar system with any reliable consistency. Their weapons were kinetic-based, chemically propelled, laughably primitive by imperial standards. They had no unified planetary government. They were still fractured into hundreds of squabbling nation-states. The engine processed, calculated, rendered. Projected pacification timeline, 14 standard cycles. Projected imperial casualties, 0.003% of deployed force. Recommended force deployment, 2 Dominion battle groups. Confidence interval, 99.97%. Valdorn had barely glanced at the readout. 14 cycles, practically a training exercise. He assigned it to Tactical Commander Sarathol, a young, ambitious officer who needed a simple conquest to pad his service record before being assigned to the real campaigns on the Outer Rim. The kind of mission where a commander could look competent without breaking a sweat. 2 battle groups, 47 warships, 90,000 Valdris assault troops, against one small, divided, primitive world. It should have been over before it started. The first signal came in on Cycle 3. Sarath-ul was reviewing extraction projections for the human northern continent when his communication officer, a pale-crested Valdris named Orveth, went unusually quiet at his station. Commander. Sarath-ul didn't look up. Report. The ground teams in Sector Ven have stopped transmitting. He looked up then. All of them? Yes, Commander. All 43 ground teams in Sector Ven simultaneously. Sarath-ul set down his data slate very slowly. 43 teams didn't go silent simultaneously from equipment failure. Last known transmission? Orveth's crest flattened, the Valdris equivalent of a deep frown. They were reporting routine pacification operations. Local resistance had been minimal. Then, he paused, his voice dropping half a register. Then one of them transmitted a single phrase before the signal cut. What phrase? Orveth looked at his commander with the expression of someone who very badly did not want to say the next words out loud. They're not running. The command bridge went very, very quiet. In 412 conquests, the Valdris ground forces had a universal experience. Every species, every civilization, every culture, when confronted with imperial assault troops, their technology, their numbers, their absolute ferocity, ran. It was not cowardice. It was biology. Every sentient species in the known galaxy had a survival mechanism that recognized an overwhelming predator and screamed escape. Every species had that mechanism. Sarath-ul stood up slowly from his command chair. Get me visual on Sector Ven. That's the other problem, Commander. Orveth's voice was barely above a whisper now. The orbital observation platforms over Sector Ven are also offline. Offline. Destroyed, sir. Something came up from the surface and destroyed them. But our sensors can't identify the launch signature. It doesn't match any human weapon system in our database. Sarath-ul stared at him. Any weapon system? Any system we have on record, Commander. Whatever took out those platforms, and we don't know what it is. The supreme commander of 2 Valdris battle groups stood on the bridge of the most powerful warship in the sector and felt, for the first time in his decorated career, something cold move through his chest. He pulled up the intelligence dossier on Earth again. Read it from the beginning this time. Not skimming. Reading. His eyes stopped on a passage he had ignored the first time. A cultural note filed by a xenosociologist in the pre-invasion assessment team. The kind of soft science commentary that tactical commanders routinely dismissed. Note of interest. Humans are the only species in our survey catalog that has, at various points in their history, deliberately trained specific members of their population not to suppress their violent threat response, but to amplify it. They have cultural institutions, these spanning thousands of years, dedicated to producing individuals in whom the survival flight instinct has been systematically inverted. These individuals do not run from danger. They have been conditioned, through processes that vary by culture and era, but share remarkable functional consistency, to move toward it. Furthermore, and this analyst considers this the most significant finding in the entire assessment, the humans do not consider this unusual. They celebrate it. They name these individuals, construct mythology around them, grant them status and resources. In every other species surveyed, such individuals would be classified as neurologically aberrant. Among humans, they are the ones placed in charge of defense. Recommendation: adjust confidence interval. This variable has not been adequately weighted. Sirath Ul read it twice. Then he opened a direct channel to Supreme Executor Vile Dorn. "Sir," he said, "I think we may have made an error." 3 weeks before the Valdris fleet entered Earth's solar system, a man named Marcus Hale was sitting in a classified briefing room somewhere beneath a mountain range that doesn't appear on any publicly available map. He was 38 years old. He had no social media presence, no public records past the age of 19, and 3 passports, all in different names. His file, had anyone outside the room been cleared to read it, contained a psychological evaluation that used the word anomalous 14 times in 11 pages. Across the table from him sat 11 other people. They did not look like soldiers. That was the first thing anyone who stumbled into that room by accident would have noticed. Soldiers have a particular kind of stillness, a discipline, a rigidity, a posture that speaks of hierarchy, absorbed into bone. The people in this room had stillness too, but it was a different kind entirely. The stillness of something that has stopped pretending. Their names in the official documentation were listed as unit designation, Chimera. 12 individuals drawn from programs that officially did not exist, recruited through channels that officially had never operated, trained in facilities that officially had never been built. The woman at the head of the table was Colonel Yara Vasquez. She had no official rank because her branch of service had no official name. What she had instead was 17 years of operational history in places where conventional military presence was considered too visible, too accountable, or too human. She looked around the table at the 11 people in front of her. "The Valdris Imperium," she said, "has conquered 412 worlds. Their invasion model assumes that every civilization they encounter will respond to overwhelming force the same way, with panic, fragmentation, and eventual collapse." She paused. That model has never failed. Nobody at the table said anything. They had been briefed on the fleet in orbit, the numbers, the firepower, the casualty projections if Earth attempted a conventional military response. They had all read the numbers. None of them looked particularly concerned. That, Vasquez reflected, was precisely why they were in this room. "Every nation contributing to this operation has submitted its best," she continued. "Special operations veterans, intelligence operatives, psychological warfare specialists, people who have spent careers learning to operate in environments where the expected response is not available to them." She let that sit for a moment. "The Valdris have a war model built on pattern recognition. They've seen hundreds of species. They've cataloged every possible variation of organized resistance." She looked around the table one more time. "They have never seen us." What the Valdris had not understood, what their war model had catastrophically failed to weight, was the specific product of human history. Most civilizations, when they developed warfare, developed it as an extension of territorial instinct. They built armies, hierarchies, systems of organized force that could be mapped, predicted, countered. The Valdris had conquered armies. They were very good at it. But humans had not only built armies. Over 10,000 years of recorded conflict, a small subset of humanity had gone somewhere else entirely. Not bigger armies, not more powerful weapons. Something stranger, more dangerous, and far harder to model. Call it what the recruiting files called it. Asymmetric persistence, the capacity to continue operating, effectively, creatively, lethally, in conditions that would render conventional military units non-functional. No supply lines, no chain of command, no tactical certainty, no safe direction, no reliable intelligence, no reasonable expectation of survival. Not just tolerating those conditions, preferring them, because in chaos, pattern recognition-based war models stop working. And the people in that room had spent their entire careers learning to generate chaos. Corporal Jinsu Park had once spent 41 days alone behind enemy lines in a region without resupply, communications, or extraction possibility, and had come out the other side having completed his mission and, by his own account in the debrief, feeling clearer than he had in years. Sergeant Amara Osei had been captured twice by hostile forces. She had escaped both times, and neither facility had been functional afterwards. The psychological evaluation after the second incident had noted, with visible professional discomfort, that her stress cortisol levels during captivity had been lower than baseline. Warrant Officer Dmitry Varenkov communicated primarily through gesture and expression. When he did speak, it was in short declarative sentences. His evaluations contained phrases like, "does not experience threat stimuli in a normative fashion," and recommend further study before standard deployment. He had been in Chimera for 9 years. Lieutenant Seo Yeon Kwan had a doctorate in cognitive systems from a university she had never attended, in a name she no longer used. She had also, at some point in her career, talked her way out of 3 different execution orders using 3 different languages, one of which she had learned during the 48 hours preceding each incident, respectively. These were not extraordinary people by normal metrics. By normal metrics, several of them would have required significant intervention. But on a planet being approached by an alien empire with a 99.97% confidence interval, normal metrics were the least useful thing available. The Valdris made landfall on the European continent first. It was a strategic choice. Dense population, multiple centers of political power, high visibility. The kind of landing that broke morale. Imperial doctrine called it impression strike. Overwhelming force deployed in the most psychologically significant location to trigger cascading civilian panic and governmental collapse. It worked. It always worked. The human governments fractured exactly as projected. Emergency broadcasts, competing evacuation orders, political leaders contradicting each other. The civilian population flooded transport networks. Communications went to static in the targeted zones. The Dominion engine processed the data feeds and returned a satisfied status. Pacification, proceeding within projected parameters. The first 3 Valdris assault groups moved into the city centers. 48 hours of impression strike, then a broadcast offering surrender terms, generous by imperial standards, deliberately so because a fast capitulation was more efficient than prolonged resistance. 48 hours passed. The surrender broadcast went out. Silence. Not the silence of capitulation, not the silence of communication infrastructure collapse. The comms were working fine. The Valdris were monitoring them. The silence was human governments looking at each other and apparently deciding not to answer. Sarathul found this baffling. Run the behavioral model again. Already run, sir. Confidence interval unchanged. The projection indicates a response within the next 6 standard hours. They may simply need more time to organize the formal transmission. He nodded, waited. 6 hours later, the response came. Not from a government, not from a military command structure, from the ground, from inside the controlled zones. The assault team commander in the Brussels sector filed the report with shaking hands. Metaphorically speaking, since Valdris anatomy didn't quite work that way, but the behavioral equivalent was unmistakable. His name was Subcommander Vail Arak, and he had been on 11 pacification campaigns. He was not inexperienced. What had happened in the Brussels sector had no precedent in his 11 campaigns. His forces had established a perimeter, standard grid, every road in and out monitored. The local population had been contained in the central district, an efficient arrangement, familiar from a dozen other worlds. Then, over a period of approximately 6 hours, 17 of his soldiers had simply disappeared. Not retreated from, not fled by, disappeared. No bodies, no evidence of engagement, no noise, no weapon signatures, no indication of a firefight. His men had been standing their posts, and then they had not been standing their posts, and there was nothing in between those two states that his sensors could detect. And then, and this was the part of the report that made Sarathol read it 3 times to make sure he had the translation correct. The humans had given them back. Not killed, not prisoners. Returned. Left at the perimeter. Alive. Unharmed. Except that every single one of them had been stripped of their weapons, their communications equipment, their tactical armor, and their unit identification. They had been returned in their underlayer clothing, disoriented, with no memory of the interval between disappearing and reappearing, and attached to the tunic of each returned soldier, in the Valdris written language, in characters precise enough to have been penned by someone who had studied it, was a single sentence, the same sentence, on all 17. We found your soldiers. We are returning them. Next time, we will not. Colonel Vasquez stood in a drainage tunnel beneath what had been, until 72 hours ago, an occupied city center. Around her, 11 people were doing various things with the quiet, unhurried focus of individuals who considered the current situation entirely manageable. Park was reassembling a piece of Valdris communications equipment with the practiced ease of a man who had spent the previous 4 hours learning to read alien firmware architecture. Quan was translating a Valdris tactical codebook she had acquired, the report didn't specify how, in the past 18 hours. Varenkov was asleep, deliberately and without apology, because he had a 4-hour window before his next operational tasking, and he used available time efficiently. Status, Vasquez said. Osei looked up from her position near the tunnel access. Asset network is operational in all 5 sectors. Contact established with 43 local civilian nodes. Supply corridor to the northern route is open. Their orbital scan frequency. Every 4 minutes, 11 seconds. We have mapped the blind spots. They're consistent. Their scanning protocol is standardized, not adaptive. Vasquez absorbed this. Of course it is. She said it not with contempt, but with something closer to professional recognition. 412 worlds, and it's always worked. No reason to make it adaptive. This was the thing that the Dominion engine had failed to calculate. Not the firepower, not the numbers, not even the specific individuals, remarkable as they were. The orientation. The Valdris built their war model on the assumption that every species when invaded was trying to stop the invasion. The natural, logical response to an overwhelming force was to find a way to match it, overpower it, push it back. That was not what Chimera was doing. They were not trying to win a war. They were not even trying to fight one in the conventional sense. They were trying to make the war unnavigable. Every move they made was designed not to destroy Valdris forces, but to destroy Valdris certainty. To take a war model built on pattern recognition and introduce so much noise, so much contradiction, so many variables that fell outside the predicted range, that the model simply stopped producing reliable outputs. 17 soldiers returned in their underwear, alive and unharmed, told the Valdris nothing about what had happened to them. But it told them something far more destabilizing, that the enemy had decided to return them, which meant the enemy had made a choice, which meant the enemy was operating with a goal that wasn't immediately legible. An enemy you couldn't read was an enemy you couldn't model. And an enemy you couldn't model was the one thing in 412 campaigns the Valdris had never encountered. Sarath-ul called an emergency command council on Cycle 6. His senior commanders were arrayed around the tactical display, a holographic representation of the occupied zones, updated in real time with sensor data. From orbit, it looked controlled. The grid was maintained, the perimeters were holding, the civilian population was contained. But the data inside the perimeters was increasingly difficult to interpret. 17 additional soldiers missing from Sector Gamma, said his intelligence officer Subcommander Rethvalin. None recovered this time. No message, no indication of method. They were present at 0400, absent by 0600. The communications relay in Sector Delta? Destroyed. The replacement was destroyed within 40 minutes of installation. The secondary replacement was destroyed within 20 minutes. We have no communication capability in that sector. A pause. We also believe our channel encryption has been compromised, but we cannot confirm this because anything we transmit on that channel to confirm the compromise would itself be compromised. The food supply depot in Sector Vane? Rethvalin hesitated. Among the Valdris, hesitation was unusual. It indicated processing difficulty, a situation where available data was insufficient to produce a conclusion. The depot is functional, intact. However, we recommend against using it. Why? Another hesitation. Because we do not know how it remained intact. Everything around it in a 300-unit radius was damaged in the night operation. The depot itself was untouched, which is either an oversight on the part of the attackers, she paused, or it is not an oversight. Sarath-ul stared at the display. They left the food supply deliberately. We believe so. To make us uncertain whether it's safe. Yes. He looked at the hologram for a long time. Run a consumption risk analysis. Already done. The analysis indicates a 34% probability the depot has been compromised in some fashion. But the analysis is based on standard interference patterns, and these attackers have not been following standard patterns. Adjusting for unknown variables, the true probability range is between 12% and 71%. That's not an analysis, that's a shrug. Yes, Commander, it is. What the Valdris were experiencing had a name in human military theory. Vasquez had studied it for 20 years. It was older than any weapon system, older than any technology, as old as human conflict itself. Psychological attrition, not the destruction of an enemy's forces, the destruction of an enemy's will to continue, the systematic erosion of confidence, certainty, and the sense that the war was manageable. You couldn't fight what you couldn't find. You couldn't plan against what you couldn't predict. You couldn't maintain morale in forces that didn't know where the threat was coming from, how many there were, what they wanted, or what the rules of engagement were. The Valdris had landed 90,000 troops. Chimera had 12 people. And every single day, the Valdris war model diverged further from observed reality. On Cycle 9, a Valdris unit in the northern sector encountered something they filed as contact with hostile personnel, and then, in the same report, spent 6 paragraphs struggling to accurately describe. They had been moving through a cleared residential district. All civilians removed, all structures checked, all routes mapped. A standard patrol. They had done 100 of them since landing. They heard music, human music, a single instrument, something unfamiliar to them, melodic and unhurried, coming from inside a building they had cleared 6 hours prior. Doctrine said, investigate, suppress, report. 12 soldiers entered the building. The music stopped. 4 minutes later, 8 of the 12 came back out. The other 4 did not come out. The 8 who returned could not describe what had happened to the 4 who hadn't, not because they were being uncooperative, but because, as their debrief established beyond reasonable doubt, they genuinely did not know. They had been in the same room. The 4 had simply ceased to be present. But here was the part of the report that Sarath-ul read 4 times. The 8 who returned were, by every measurable metric, physically unharmed. But in the debrief, every one of them used the same unprompted phrase when asked to describe the experience. In 8 different soldiers, without coordination, in separate debrief sessions. They were watching us the whole time. Not we were attacked. Not they ambushed us. They were watching us the whole time, as if the entire patrol had been, from beginning to end, observed, studied. As if every Valdris soldier in that district had been walking through someone else's intelligence operation without knowing it. The psychological effect on the unit was not catalogued by any Valdris measurement system, because Valdris measurement systems did not have a category for it. What the unit had experienced, a human psychologist would have identified immediately. They had felt hunted. On Cycle 11, Sarathul did something no Valdris commander in 412 campaigns had ever done. He broadcast a request for direct communication, not surrender terms, not ultimatum, a request. He used the human linguistic databases captured in the first landing cycle, and he transmitted on every available frequency a message in 11 human languages. I wish to speak with your commanders. For 18 hours, there was no response. Then, on a frequency he hadn't transmitted on, a frequency that, according to his communications officer, his fleet was not currently monitoring, which meant whoever was transmitting it had known his scanning pattern well enough to find a gap in it. A single voice came through. Human, female, unhurried. You don't have commanders in your database for us. Sarath-ul leaned forward in his command chair. Then who am I speaking to? A pause. Not hesitation, consideration. The people your model didn't account for. I have become aware, he said carefully, that my operational projections were inaccurate. Yes. I would like to understand why. The voice was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, there was something in its tone that he couldn't quite categorize. Not hostility, not gloating. Something more like a teacher with a student who had finally asked the right question. You built a model. 412 worlds. Every species in your catalog sent you their armies, their soldiers, people trained to fight, and also trained to stop fighting when the math stopped working, when the losses got too high, when the supplies ran out, when the chain of command fractured. Yes, Sarathul said. That is correct. We didn't send those people. He waited. Every species you've conquered has soldiers. They're the people a civilization builds to protect itself, trained to use force, but also trained to know when force isn't working, and to report that up the chain so someone can make a decision. Yes. We have those people too, we didn't send them. A pause. We sent the ones that don't report it up the chain, the ones that don't stop when the math stops working, the ones who have been specifically prepared over years for the condition you created. No supply lines, no communications, no tactical certainty, no clear chain of command. Operating inside an occupied zone against a technologically superior force. Sarath-ul said nothing. He was listening very carefully. You wanted a war. Your model told you what that would look like. You expected soldiers because every other species you've faced has sent soldiers. What you got instead was something your model has no category for. And what is that? The answer came without hesitation. People for whom this is normal. Sarathul sat with that for a long time after the channel closed. He pulled up the Dominion engine's original projection. Confidence interval, 99.97%. He looked at the assumptions embedded in that number. Every one of them logical. Every one of them drawn from a robust dataset. Every one of them assuming that the humans would respond to invasion the way every other species had. The Dominion engine didn't have a failure mode for an enemy that welcomed the conditions of asymmetric occupation. It had no category for combatants whose training was specifically designed for the exact scenario the Valdris had created. A populated zone, denied to conventional forces, with degraded communications and no clear front line. Because no species had ever sent those people. No species had ever had those people, or if they had recognized what they were, and put them specifically in charge of this. He opened a direct channel to Supreme Executor Vale Dorn. Sir. Report, Commander. Sir, I recommend immediate revision of the Dominion engine's assessment parameters for the human species. A pause. The engine shows pacification at 61% completion. The engine's data inputs are compromised, sir. We believe our communications have been monitored since Cycle 4. The 61% figure is based on controlled zone telemetry that may have been deliberately manipulated. A longer pause. Manipulated by whom? Their governments collapsed in Cycle 2. There is no command structure. That is correct, sir. There is no command structure. He paused. I believe that is the point. Part 5. The Reckoning, minutes 23 to 25. On Cycle 14, the day the Dominion engine had projected full pacification, the Valdris fleet received a transmission, not from a government. Governments had indeed collapsed, just as projected, not from a military command. There was no unified military command structure left on Earth, just as projected. The transmission came from one voice, on a frequency the Valdris had spent 11 days trying and failing to locate. Short, clear, in perfect standard Valdris, spoken by someone who had apparently learned the language in the past 2 weeks. You came to a world and expected to find what you've always found. You found something else. We're giving you a choice, a courtesy you didn't extend to the 412 worlds before us. Pause. Leave. Another pause, shorter. Your fleet, your forces, everything you brought. You have 72 hours. We will not interfere with your withdrawal. We will not fire on your ships. We will not pursue. And then, the sentence that made every Valdris officer who heard the transmission go very, very still. But if you are still here in 72 hours, we will stop being restrained. Sarathul looked at his command council. They looked back at him. Nobody spoke for a very long time. Because the thing that turned the transmission from a bluff into something else, something credible, something that sat in the chest like a cold stone, was everything that had happened in the previous 11 cycles. 17 soldiers returned in their underwear, alive as a message. Soldiers disappearing from cleared zones with no trace. Patrols convinced they were being watched before anything happened. A food depot left intact specifically to be uncertain about. A communications frequency found in a gap in their own scanning pattern. All of it restrained. All of it calibrated. Every action designed not to maximize casualties, but to maximize psychological effect, which meant the people behind it were entirely capable of deciding what level of force to apply, which meant restrained was a real description, which meant what came after restrained was real too. Sarathul looked at the Dominion engine's current output. It had stopped producing confidence intervals 6 cycles ago. The data was too noisy. It was returning a status it had never returned in 412 campaigns. Insufficient pattern data, unable to project. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened the fleet-wide command channel. All units, this is Commander Sarathul. Begin withdrawal protocols. They left in 61 hours, 11 hours ahead of the deadline. Nobody discussed that detail in the debrief. It wasn't the kind of thing Valdris commanders put in reports. Back on the human side, in a tunnel beneath a city that was just beginning to understand that the ships in orbit were moving, Colonel Vasquez looked at the sensor feed on a small captured Valdris display and watched the fleet begin to pull back. Nobody in the tunnel cheered. Nobody celebrated. Park looked up from the piece of equipment he was still out of what appeared to be pure professional interest, reverse engineering. Osei tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was recalculating something. Varenkov opened his eyes from his rest position, observed the display for exactly 3 seconds, and closed them again. Vasquez looked at the feed a moment longer, then she turned back to the room. When the last ship clears sensor range, she said, then we go home. Nobody argued with that. They waited. 3 months later, in a different part of the galaxy, Supreme Executor Vale Dorn was called before the Valdris High Command to explain the first failed pacification in the history of the Dominion. He brought the Dominion engine's final output, the sensor logs, every report from every ground commander. He laid it all out, methodically, in the precise and detailed manner of a man who had spent a long time understanding exactly what had happened and was not looking forward to explaining it. The High Command listened. When he was done, the eldest of them, a figure whose service record stretched back 100 years and spanned wars that had made the Valdris what they are, asked a single question. You're telling me we lost to 12 people? Vile Dorn considered the precise accuracy of that statement. No, sir, he said. We lost to what 12 people are. There's a difference. The elder looked at him for a long time. Update the engine, she said finally. Add a new category. What category? She looked at the planet's designation on the tactical display. The small, oxygen-rich world in a minor spiral arm. The young species. The divided civilization. The primitive weapons. Unprojectable, she said. And for the first time in the history of the Valdris Dominion, a world in their catalog was marked not as pacified, not as pending, not as contested, but as do not engage. Somewhere in a tunnel beneath a rebuilding city, a woman with no public records and 3 passports read the final intelligence report, confirming the Valdris had left the solar system entirely. She set it down. She made coffee. The war, if it had ever really been a war, was over. It had lasted 14 cycles. Just like the engine predicted, for entirely the wrong reasons. The last sound humanity made before going silent was not a scream. It was not a prayer, not a plea, not the desperate crackle of a dying distress signal flung into uncaring stars. The last sound humanity made, the final transmission broadcast from the Sol system on the 14th of March 2287, was 3 words, delivered in a voice so calm, it disturbed every xenolinguist who later studied the recording. 3 words. We will remember. Then silence. 100 years of silence. The Keith Dominion had been methodical about it. That was what the other species remembered most. Not the scale of the massacre, not the duration, not even the screaming in those final weeks. What they remembered was how organized it was, how the Keith fleet had arrived in triangulated formation, 17 dreadnoughts and 240 support vessels, emerging from fold space at the precise gravitational coordinates that ensured Earth's defensive grid would be blinded by its own magnetosphere for exactly 9 minutes. 9 minutes. That was all the Keith needed. The orbital platforms were gone in the first 3, the deep space listening arrays in the next 4. In the final 2 minutes before Earth systems could compensate and reorient, the Keth unleashed what their own military historians would later call the quieting pulse, a focused tachyon disruption wave that didn't destroy ships, didn't detonate cities, didn't vaporize oceans. It simply ended communications. Every quantum-entangled relay, every Ansible beacon, every long-range transmitter from Mercury's sun-baked surface to the Kuiper Belt listening posts. Gone. Not destroyed in fire, but quietly, clinically severed. As though a surgeon had cut the vocal cords of a species. The Keth called it mercy. They called it surgical. What followed was not surgical. What followed was the Tyrant Fleet's ground campaign across 17 human colony worlds, Proxima Station, the Eden Clusters, New Carthage, the Kepler Belt settlements, all of them, in a 6-week campaign that the Galactic Historical Commission would later classify under a single, bureaucratic heading, Population Reduction Event, Sol Arm, 2287. 14 billion human beings. Gone in 6 weeks. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session 11 days after the last confirmed human signal. Ambassador Vreth of the Hegemony of Aligned Worlds stood at the central podium and delivered what historians would later call the most shamefully pragmatic speech in the Council's 4,000-year history. The human species, Vreth said, in that measured, layered voice of the hegemony, has demonstrated that it lacks the resilience required for galactic citizenship. Their silence confirms what we have long suspected, that humanity was an anomaly, a flash of potential that burned too quickly, too brightly, and too briefly. We mourn the loss of 14 billion lives. We also acknowledge that resistance to the Keth Dominion at this juncture would destabilize the Lyran Accord and invite retaliatory campaigns against 8 other species. The vote to formally decline intervention passed 43-1. The one dissenting vote came from a species called the Vylori, a quiet, ancient race of deep ocean dwellers from a world called Thessara Minor. The Vylori ambassador, a towering creature of bioluminescent flesh and slow, deliberate movement, cast her vote, and then said only this before leaving the chamber. "You are all making a catastrophic mistake." No one asked her to clarify. The Keth had expected humanity to collapse. 14 billion dead. Communications severed. Fleet destroyed. Colonies burning. Every military model in the Dominion's war planning archives pointed to the same projected outcome. Within 18 months, the surviving human population, estimated at roughly 400 million, scattered across remote mining outposts, deep space stations, and the underdeveloped outer colonies, would fragment, turn inward, collapse into feudalism or simple extinction. They had seen it happen to 4 other species. They watched the human systems carefully for the first year, then the second, then the 5th. The silence held. No transmissions, no fleet movements, no diplomatic overtures, no desperate pleas to the Galactic Council. Nothing. By the 20th year of silence, the Keth High Command had downgraded humanity from contained threat to residual population. By the 40th year, humanity barely appeared in their intelligence briefings. By the 60th year, there was a formal proposal within the Keth Senate to redirect the small garrison fleet watching the Sol Arm to more pressing frontier duties. The proposal passed. The garrison was withdrawn, and in the quiet of abandoned space in the dark between stars where no Keth sensor array was watching, something extraordinary was happening. Humanity was not dying. Humanity was building. On a deep space station called Cradle, so far from the Sol system that its coordinates weren't even listed in Keth navigational charts, a woman named Admiral Sarah Voss stood before a wall of light. The wall stretched 30 meters across and 12 high, embedded in the command center of a station that officially did not exist. It was not a screen. It was a map, a living, constantly updated, 3-dimensional strategic display of the entire known galaxy. Every star system color-coded, every known Keth installation marked in burning red, every human asset marked in deep, cold blue. There were, by this point, a great many blue markers, more than the Keth would have believed possible, more perhaps than the Galactic Council deserved to know. Admiral Voss was 63 years old. She had been 4 years old when the Keth came. She did not remember Earth from experience. She remembered it from the oral histories her grandmother had recorded on a handheld device in the last weeks before the colony ship left, fleeing through a debris corridor the Keth hadn't bothered to watch. She pressed her palm flat against the map's surface. Somewhere in the glowing geometry of stars and distances, she touched the point where Earth had been. 94 years, said the man behind her. His name was Director Okan, and he was the oldest human being currently alive at 117, kept functional by medical technology they'd developed in secret. He spoke quietly, as was his habit. The Council has their summit on Thesara Minor in 6 years. That's when the Valori have called the alignment. I know, said Voss. The fleet will be ready. I know that too. She didn't move her hand from the map. They thought silence was surrender, she said. Okan was quiet for a long moment. Let them keep thinking that, he said, for 6 more years. To understand what humanity had built in 100 years of silence, one must first understand what humanity had lost, and then understand, with cold clarity, that grief, when given enough time and enough purpose, does not make a species weaker. It makes them architectural. In the first decade after the massacre, the surviving 400 million humans had done something the Keth's models never predicted. They didn't scatter. They contracted. It was a decision made not by any single government, those were gone, but by a loose constellation of surviving military commanders, scientists, and colony administrators who found each other through tight beam laser communication, a technology so old and so limited in range that the Keth hadn't even bothered to monitor for it. Laser communication traveled at the speed of light. It required precise alignment between sender and receiver. In a galaxy that moved in 3 dimensions, it was, by most galactic standards, laughably primitive, which meant it was completely invisible to the Keth. The first message passed through the network took 11 years to reach all its destinations, bounced from station to asteroid to distant colony, each node receiving it and passing it on in silence, like a secret whispered through a chain of 1,000 hands. The message was brief. It said, "We are gathering. Coordinates follow. Come dark. Come quiet. Come prepared to wait." The coordinates pointed to a region of space the Galactic Council called the Null Drift, a wide band of densely packed nebula gas and magnetic interference that made long-range sensor sweeps nearly impossible. It was considered strategically valueless. No habitable worlds, no mineable asteroids of significance. No reason for any advanced civilization to spend resources exploring it. It was, in other words, perfect. The station called Cradle was built over 20 years, entirely within the Null Drift, using materials stripped from abandoned colony ships and mined from the interior of a rogue planetoid they'd captured and hollowed out. At its peak population, Cradle housed 11,000 people. It had no external lighting. Its hull was coated in a composite material that absorbed radar, sound, and most scanning frequencies. It maintained communication silence as a religion. Cradle was not the only station. By year 30, there were 9 such installations scattered through the Null Drift and the adjacent quiet zones, each one isolated, each one communicating with the others only through the Laser Whisper network, each one dedicated to a specific function. Station Cradle, Military Command and Strategic Planning. Station Foundry, Weapons Manufacturing and Ship Construction. Station Lexicon, Intelligence Gathering and Xenolinguistics. Station Anamnesis, Historical Preservation and Cultural Memory. Station Prometheus, Scientific Research and Advanced Technology Development. And 4 others whose names were never spoken aloud outside their own walls, because their purposes were darker, more patient, and more terrible than the others. The ships they built were unlike anything in the Keth's tactical databases, because the Keth's tactical databases were 40 years out of date by the time humanity began launching them. The first generation had been conventional enough. Retrofitted colony ships repurposed as warships. Their cargo bays replaced with weapon systems adapted from salvaged Keth technology. The humans had studied every piece of Keth hardware they could recover. They were methodical about it. Every wrecked Keth ship from the original assault that could be reached was reached, stripped, analyzed, cataloged, understood. But the humans hadn't stopped at understanding. They had improved. By year 50, Station Foundry was producing vessels that bore no resemblance to any ship class in known galactic history. They were built around a design philosophy the engineers called Doctrine of Ghost. Vessels that were simultaneously as destructive as possible and as detectable as nothing. The hull geometry was fractal, designed to scatter sensor pings in 17 different directions simultaneously. The drive systems were completely enclosed within layers of dampening material, producing no heat signature detectable beyond 30,000 kilometers. The weapon systems were built around a technology the human physicists had developed from first principles, one they called the null projector, which did not fire a beam or a projectile or an energy wave but instead collapsed a precise volume of space into a temporary null state, a bubble of absolute zero energy that caused any matter inside it to undergo catastrophic atomic unraveling. The null projector had a range of 200,000 kilometers. The largest Keth dreadnought had hull armor rated to withstand a sustained plasma bombardment at close range for 40 minutes. Against a null projector, hull armor was a philosophical concept with no practical value. But weapons were only part of what grew in the dark. The other part was intelligence. Station Lexicon had spent 100 years doing something so patient, so painstaking, so utterly without drama, that it barely appeared in the stories humans told themselves about their century of silence. Lexicon's people had spent 100 years listening, not transmitting, not responding, just listening. Every transmission the Keth sent through open channels, every diplomatic communication between the Keth Dominion and the Galactic Council, every trade negotiation, every military bulletin, every census report, every internal political argument broadcast over the Keth public communication network, every language, every cipher, every data format the Keth used, understood, cataloged, broken. By year 60, Lexicon could read every Keth military communique in real time. By year 80, Lexicon had assets, people, devices, and in some cases carefully cultivated relationships with other non-Keth species, positioned near every major Keth installation in the galaxy. By year 100, Lexicon knew the location of every Keth military vessel, the rotation schedule of every garrison, the chain of command of every fleet, the political fault lines within the Keth Senate, the name of every Keth admiral who had participated in the original assault on human space and the current coordinates of each one. This information had been compiled into a document. The document had a title. It was called the Ledger. The person who had compiled the ledger was a woman named Commandant Yara Dali, who ran Station Lexicon with the focused intensity of someone who had been born into a specific purpose and had never once been distracted from it. Dali was the daughter of refugees. Her parents had been aboard one of the last colony ships to escape the Sol system, young and terrified and carrying nothing but the genetic material of humanity's future and a portable drive containing the entire Library of Congress, the complete works of every human composer, and a single family photograph taken on a beach on Earth in 2281. The beach no longer existed. Neither did the ocean it had sat beside. Dali kept a copy of the photograph on her desk. She was not sentimental about it. It was not there to comfort her. It was there to remind her of the arithmetic, of what had been lost and what was owed. She was reviewing the ledger when her communications officer entered with a tight beam message from Admiral Voss at Cradle. 6 years, the message said. Dali set down the ledger and looked at the photograph. 6 years, she agreed. On the Keth homeworld of Keth Prime, a vast, dry, red-dusted world of canyon cities and orbital megastructures, the political conversation about humanity had reduced itself to an almost ceremonial formality. Once a decade, the Senate's Frontier Affairs Committee published a brief report on the status of residual human populations. The report for year 90 had been 3 paragraphs. The report for year 100 was 2. The second paragraph noted, with bureaucratic indifference, that deep space sensor sweeps of the former human territories had detected nothing of note. No fleet activity, no construction signatures, no communication signals. The third paragraph recommended formally reclassifying humanity from residual population to extinct or near extinct species, historical category. The motion passed without debate. The Senate moved on to other business. What no Keth sensor had detected, and what no Keth analyst had thought to look for, was the specific gravitational signature of 312 warships moving in absolute communication silence through the dense nebula of the null drift toward their designated jump coordinates. 312 ships, the largest human fleet ever assembled, crewed by men and women who had been born in secret, raised in the dark, trained for a single purpose, and who had grown up hearing the same 3 words, the last words humanity had spoken to the galaxy before going silent, passed from parent to child, from commander to recruit, from old to young, like a torch kept burning in a closed room. We will remember. They remembered. The Galactic Council Summit on Thesera Minor occurred every 50 years, and the one in 2387 was expected to be unremarkable. The Valori had requested it be held on their world this cycle, which was unusual. The Valori rarely sought the spotlight of galactic politics, but not so unusual as to attract significant comment. The agenda included trade route renegotiations in the Lyran Arm, the ongoing territorial dispute between the Hegemony and the Garan Collective, and a scheduled ceremonial moment in which humanity would be formally reclassified, and a small memorial would be dedicated, because even the galactic community had its gestures. 41 ambassadors arrived on Thesera Minor over the 3 days preceding the summit's opening session. They came in their finest ships, with their retinues and their political agendas, and they settled into the sweeping architecture of the council hall, which the Valori had built at the bottom of a shallow ocean. Its walls made of living coral, its ceiling open to the filtered light of a pale blue sun. The Keth delegation arrived last, as was their custom, a display of precedence that no one protested because no one had ever successfully protested anything the Keth did. High Provost Dan Ethrek led the delegation. He was the political successor to the Keth commanders who had overseen the original assault, and he wore that legacy without shame or apology. He was tall, angular, his gray-plated skin bearing the formal markings of the Dominion's senior military caste. He had never once, in 40 years of political life, been asked to answer for what his species had done in 2287. He took his seat at the head of the Keth delegation and waited for the summit to begin. The Valori ambassador, an ancient creature named Tessara who persists, moved to the central podium. She said, "Before we begin the formal agenda, there is a matter we must address." Ethrek leaned slightly forward. There was something in the old Valori's voice, a quality he couldn't quite identify. He had heard Tessara who persists speak many times over the decades, and she had always sounded like deep water, patient, unhurried. This was different. She sounded, he realized after a moment, like deep water that was beginning to move. 100 years ago, she said, this council voted to decline intervention following the Keth Dominion's assault on human space. I cast the one dissenting vote. I said at the time that this council was making a catastrophic mistake. Ethrek straightened. Around him, the other Keth delegates shifted. This was not the usual opening. I would like, Tessara who persists said, and now her bioluminescence pulsed in a slow, deep wave across her entire body, to formally amend my earlier statement. She paused. It was not a mistake. It was a choice, and choices have consequences. She stepped back from the podium. The lights in the council hall went out. Not the emergency darkness of a power failure, not the sudden blackout of an attack. The lights went out the way a held breath is released, controlled, deliberate, purposeful. And in the absolute dark of the coral hall at the bottom of the Valori Ocean, the ceiling above the assembled ambassadors lit up, not with filtered sunlight, with starships. 312 vessels had entered the Thessera minor system 11 hours ago, moving at minimum drive power, coated in the darkness of their ghost hulls, dropping out of fold space at coordinates so far from the system's sensor perimeter that by the time the automated arrays would have detected them, it would have been too late. It was too late. The ships hung in orbit above the Valori world, each one still running silent, each one dark, but visible now in the bioluminescent display the Valori had woven into the council hall's living ceiling. Not as threats, as a demonstration, as a statement. The hall erupted. 40 ambassadors speaking at once in 37 languages, their translation implants cascading into overlapping chaos, security systems activating. Keth delegates reaching for communication devices that had suddenly, inexplicably stopped functioning. Ethrek stood. He had been a political creature for 40 years, which meant he had learned the skill of projecting calm when what he felt was the opposite of calm. He stood, and he looked at the ceiling and he counted ships with the trained eye of the military caste he'd been born into. He counted to 300. He kept counting. When the lights returned, the woman standing at the central podium was not Tessara who persists. She was human. She was not tall. She was not imposing in the conventional sense. She wore no military regalia beyond a single emblem on the collar of her dark jacket. A small blue circle with a white point of light at its center, which those with knowledge of old Earth cartography might have recognized as a stylized representation of the pale blue dot. The way Earth had looked once from very far away. Admiral Sarah Voss looked at the assembled ambassadors of the Galactic Council, with eyes that had spent 40 years reading star maps in the dark, and she said, in a voice that carried the weight of 100 years of silence, "My name is Sarah Voss. I represent the reconstituted Human Directorate. We are not extinct. We are not residual. We are not surrendered." She let that settle. 100 years ago, 14 billion human beings were murdered in a 6-week campaign authorized and celebrated by the Keth Dominion. This council voted not to intervene. 43-1, her eyes found the Keth delegation. We have spent 100 years deciding what to do about that. High Provost Ethrek had recovered enough to speak. He had political reflexes as highly tuned as any creature in the galaxy, and those reflexes were already calculating fleet position, escape vectors, the likelihood that those ships in orbit were equipped with weapons capable of. He stood. You have violated Galactic Council treaty space. This incursion is not an incursion, Voss said calmly. We have not fired. We have not threatened. We are here, in this hall, speaking, which is the first time a human being has spoken in this chamber in 100 years. She tilted her head slightly. You should have noticed the quiet earlier. What do you want? The question came out harder than Ethrek intended. There was something in the woman's stillness that rattled him in a way he hadn't been rattled since he searched his memory, since he was a young military attaché watching archival footage of the quieting pulse, and he'd seen in the final seconds before the recording cut out, a human face looking directly at the camera. The face had not been afraid. It had looked somehow like it was recording him. What do you want? He asked again, quieter. Voss reached into her jacket and produced a data slate. She set it on the podium. There is a document on that slate. It is called the Ledger. It contains the names of every Keth military officer who participated in the assault on human space, the assault on our colonies, and the ground campaigns that followed. It contains their current ranks, their current positions, and their current locations. The silence in the hall was absolute. It also contains the coordinates of every Keth military installation in the galaxy, the current deployment status of every Keth fleet, the names of every Keth admiral and their chain of command, the full specifications of Keth weapon systems as they existed 100 years ago, and as we believe them to exist now, and a complete political and economic analysis of the Keth Dominion's internal fault lines. She paused. We have had a long time to pay attention. Ithrek's political reflexes had gone very quiet. What was operating now was something older, something that lived beneath the political calculus and the Senate speeches and the 40 years of comfortable impunity, something that felt, distantly and with great reluctance, like fear. What? He said very carefully. Do you want? 3 things, Voss said. First, formal acknowledgement from this council that the events of 2287 constitute genocide, and that the council's vote to decline intervention was a failure of collective moral responsibility. She held up one finger. Second, the Keth Dominion will provide full territorial reparations, the restoration of all human colony worlds currently under Keth occupation, the complete withdrawal of Keth military presence from the Sol Arm, and 50 years of resource transfers sufficient to rebuild what was destroyed. 2 fingers. Third, those whose names appear in the ledger under the categories of command authorization and direct execution will be surrendered to an international tribunal for prosecution under the Galactic Convention on Mass Atrocity. 3 fingers. She lowered her hand. These are not opening positions. These are not negotiating points. These are the terms. Ethrek made a sound that was not quite a laugh. And if we refuse? Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then we will demonstrate what 312 ghost-hulled warships equipped with null projectors are capable of, she said, and you will spend the rest of the Keth Dominion's history wondering how many more there are in the dark. She picked up the data slate and set it down in front of the Keth delegation. We did not come here to destroy you, she said. We came here because we are still capable of choosing not to. But that choice has a window, High Provost, and 100 years is long enough to have learned patience. The council hall was silent for 11 seconds. Then the Valori ambassador, Tessara who persists, pressed both of her great bioluminescent hands flat against the coral floor of the hall, and her entire body blazed with light, gold and deep green and the cold blue of abyssal water, in the Valori gesture that meant, in their oldest formal language, witnessed and affirmed. One by one across the hall other ambassadors began to move. Not all of them. Not the ones who had voted with the Keth a century before without paying any price. Not immediately, but some of them. And then more. The negotiations lasted 9 days. They were the most watched 9 days in the history of the Galactic Council, watched by species who had spent a century believing humanity was gone, watched by young Keth citizens who had never been told the full history of what their dominion had done, watched by the children and grandchildren of survivors on stations throughout the Null Drift, and the quiet outer reaches where humans had lived in silence for a century. Watched on the 3rd day, when High Provost Ethrek received a private communication from the Keth Joint Military Command, a communication that Lexicon had intercepted within 4 minutes of its transmission, informing him that a preliminary analysis of the ships in orbit suggested the humans had not been bluffing about the null projectors. The tests had been inconclusive, but inconclusive, when the alternative was proving them wrong by firing, was as good as confirmed. The Keth Dominion was not fundamentally a suicidal civilization, it was a calculating one, and the calculation, by day 4, had shifted. The formal acknowledgement came on day 6. It was read aloud by the Council's senior archivist, not a Keth, at the insistence of 41 of the 42 other delegations, in a ceremony that was broadcast across every open galactic communication channel. It named 14 billion human beings who had been killed. It named the Keth Dominion as the perpetrator. It named the Council's vote as a moral failure. It was 412 words long. Admiral Voss listened to all 412 words standing perfectly still in the center of the council hall, her hands at her sides, her face composed. When the archivist finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, to no one in particular, "It's not enough." Director Okan, who had come to Thesera Minor for the occasion, and who stood just behind her right shoulder, said equally quietly, "No, it isn't. But it's a start." "Yes," he agreed. "It's a start." The territorial restoration took 11 years to complete, not because of Keth resistance and that window had passed and everyone in the galaxy now knew it, but because of the sheer physical work of rebuilding what had been destroyed. Human colony worlds that had been under Keth occupation for a century required environmental remediation, infrastructure reconstruction, and in some cases complete ecological restoration. Earth itself was the hardest. The quieting pulse had done no direct physical damage to the planet's surface. But a century of atmospheric neglect following the destruction of orbital climate management systems had resulted in changes that would take generations to reverse. The oceans had risen. The ice caps had retreated. 17 coastal cities sat beneath shallow water. They rebuilt them anyway, not in the same places. Not in the same forms, but with the same names, because names were one of the things that couldn't be taken. The tribunal was a separate and longer process. It ran for 7 years, and it was not without controversy. There were Keth political factions that called it victor's justice, and there were human voices that called it inadequate, and both assessments contained their own truths. The tribunal was imperfect. The law it applied was being written as it was being used. Of the 417 Keth officers listed in the ledger under command authorization and direct execution, 301 were brought before the tribunal. 62 had died of age or other causes in the century of human silence. 54 could not be located, and the official record noted without elaboration that Station Lexicon's intelligence suggested those 54 had not, in fact, all died of natural causes. The note in the official record was never formally disputed. On the 11th anniversary of the Thesera Minor Summit, a ceremony was held on the surface of Earth. It was not a grand ceremony. There were no orbital light shows, no fleet demonstrations, no political speeches broadcast across galactic channels. It was attended by approximately 4,000 people, most of them the oldest living humans. Those who had been children on the colony ships, who carried the physical memory of before. A monument had been built at the site of what had once been a city on the eastern coast of a continent called North America. The city had been called New York. The monument was simple, a column of black stone, 200 meters tall, engraved from base to summit with names. 14 billion names. It had taken 40 years to engrave them all. At the base of the column, a single line in the English language, the tongue that humanity had last spoken before going silent. "We will remember, and we did." Admiral Sarah Voss stood before the monument on the day of the ceremony and did something she had not done in 40 years of military command. She cried, not for long. Not in a way that her officers saw clearly, though they all looked elsewhere, with the careful tact of people who understood that some moments are private even when they happen in public. She cried because she could finally afford to, because for 100 years grief had been a weapon, carefully contained, precisely directed, transformed into something useful, into plans and training and weapons research and intelligence networks and the slow, patient architecture of vengeance that had been built in the dark. Now the dark was over. Now there was room for grief that was just grief, without a purpose attached to it. She let herself have it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she straightened, turned to face her officers and said, "We have work to do." Director Okan, who was 128 years old by this point, and who had been kept alive by medical technology that surprised even him, had spent the years since Thessera Minor doing something unexpected. He had started teaching. Not military history, not strategy, not the technical details of how humanity had built its ghost fleet in the dark. He taught the history of Earth. The small history, not the politics and the wars and the civilizational turning points, but the ordinary history. The food and the music and the games children had played, and the jokes people had told, and the books that had been written about nothing in particular. Just the feeling of being alive. He taught this to the children who had been born after Thessera Minor, who were growing up on a planet being rebuilt, who would never know Earth the way their great-grandparents had known it, but who might, if the teaching was good enough, know something essential about what they came from. One of his students, a girl of about 10, born on Earth itself in one of the new coastal cities, asked him once, "Why were you quiet for so long? Why didn't you just fight back right away?" Okan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because fighting back right away would have been fighting from anger," he said, "and anger burns hot and fast and then it's gone. What did you fight from instead?" "Something colder," he said, "something that doesn't run out." She thought about this. "What do you call that?" Okan looked out the window at the pale blue sky above a rebuilt city on a healing world, and he thought of a photograph on a desk on a station in the dark, and a wall of light covered in star maps, and a woman's voice saying 3 words into a silent galaxy. "We call it memory," he said. In the deep archives of Station Lexicon, which had been decommissioned as a military installation but preserved as a historical site, the original recording of humanity's last transmission was kept in a climate-controlled vault. It was played once, on the anniversary of the massacre. Just played, not broadcast, not performed, not narrated. Just a voice in a recording saying 3 words. The voice belonged to Commander Elena Roth, who had been the last human officer at the last operational communication array when the Keth closed in. She had been 31 years old. She had known, when she transmitted those words, that she had minutes left. She had used them well. "We will remember." The recording lasted 4 seconds. The silence after it lasted as long as the listener needed. 300 years after the massacre, a young Keth historian named Sarath published a paper that caused significant controversy within the Keth Academic Council. The paper was titled, "The Strategic Miscalculation of 2287, How the Keth Dominion Created the Conditions for Its Own Strategic Defeat by Underestimating Human Resilience and Misreading Silence as Submission." It was 11,000 words long and rigorously sourced. Its conclusion was a single paragraph. The Keth Dominion's fundamental error was not tactical, not strategic, and not technological. It was philosophical. We believed that a species which had lost the capacity to speak had lost the will to act. We did not understand, and this failure of understanding nearly proved catastrophic, that silence is not the absence of power. In humans, silence was power in its most concentrated form, restrained, directed, and waiting. We mistook the held breath for the last breath. We would have been wiser to know the difference. The paper was widely read, widely taught, and in the margins of more than one copy, in the handwriting of readers both Keth and human and from a dozen other species across the galaxy, someone had written the same 4 words. They always came back.